Well, hello and welcome, and it's great to be back with another production. And this one is going to be quite special because this year, 2022, is the 1900th anniversary of the start of the building of Hadrian's Wall. This wasn't the only wall that Hadrian built. He built walls all over the Roman Empire, and you'll find out shortly why that was. And historians amongst you will know that this wasn't the only Roman wall in Britain. There were others, but without doubt this was by far the most famous and well known. It's going to be a very busy year up here on the wall, so if you're planning your staycation for this year, be sure to include Hadrian's Wall in your itinerary. For this production, I'm going to be working with a co-presenter, Anna Gray from Discover Lakeland Guided Tours. She will be presenting the west section of the wall from Bowness-on-Solway to Chester's Bridge, and I will be covering the area from Chester's to here in Newcastle. Before we begin this journey along Hadrian's Wall, I would just like to paint some background for those of you who are not familiar with the history of the wall. The emperors of Rome prior to Hadrian were intent on expanding the Roman Empire wherever possible. When Hadrian came to power, he broke that tradition and saw consolidation of the empire as his goal. Whereas his predecessors had relied on reports from their generals about the state of the empire, Hadrian was more about seeing for himself and spent most of his reign travelling the empire. He came to power in 117 AD and visited Britain in 122 AD. Primarily to inspect the progress on the building of the wall, planned and initiated by him sometime before 122. The construction of the wall between Newcastle in the east and Bowness-on-Solway to the west was to act as a frontier between the Roman-held area of Britain and the Celtic north. Although it acted primarily as a defensive structure to deter any possible invasions or thoughts of invasions, it was also a border frontier, allowing traders to pass through at control points and pay taxes to Rome. A common misunderstanding is that the building work began in Wall's End in the east and progressed west along the wall to Bowness, but as you will learn, that is not the case. Building was carried out all along the 80 Roman miles simultaneously by numerous cohorts of workers, and it must have been quite a spectacle. Usually visitors to the wall travel east to west. We will be going west to east, and we begin here at Bowness-on-Solway.
We're at the very end, or possibly the very start of Hadrian's Wall here. Just behind me we have this construction called the Banks at Bowness-on-Solway, and this is where Hadrian's Wall is coming out of the fort of Maia, just a bit further in front of me there, and then it's continuing in an easterly direction behind me all the way to Wall's End, a distance of 80 Roman miles, which equates to about 72, 73 English miles. And the wall, it wasn't just a wall. Every Roman mile there was something called a mile castle, which is like a small fortlet, and then between those fortlets there were two turrets. So the pattern was mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, turret, turret, all the way along the wall. And although the wall actually ended here at Maya, the system of fortifications of mile fortlets and turrets did continue further to the west, going round the whole headland, around towards Maryport and beyond Maryport. However, these turrets and mile castles were not connected by a wall. So a bit further to the west is the Roman fort of Maya, which is one of the largest on the wall. And it's here on a headland just to guard the crossing point. There was actually a ford, if you like, at low tide from this point here across to the far shore, which is actually southern Scotland there. So the fort was built here to guard that crossing point. Well, hello, here we are at Banks Turret, which is turret 52A. And this is where we're going to start our exploration of Hadrian's Wall from this point here, heading eastwards here. So we've got a wonderful section of wall here. It's an original form, and behind me there is a turret. So I'm just going to at this point explain a little bit about why Hadrian's Wall was built, who built it, and how it operated. Hadrian's Wall was built in AD 122 under the orders of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian had inherited a vastly enlarged empire, and he had no wish to actually extend that any further. He wanted to consolidate the gains that had been made. So, as a result of problems with the barbarians to the north of where we are and other problems, he decided he was going to put a wall in running from the Solway Firth, Bowness, essentially over in the west, across to Wallsend in the east. Hadrian's Wall just took 6 years to complete, which is a phenomenal undertaking when you consider its width and its length. The length is actually about 72 miles, which equates to 80 Roman miles, and we'll come back to that in a moment or so. So when it was conceived as a wall, it wasn't ever meant to be a solid barrier. It's more meant to act as a frontier zone. Now, I'm going to explain to you the system of fortifications along Hadrian's Wall. Remember that the wall was actually 80 Roman miles, which is slightly shorter than an English mile. So 80 Roman miles equates to roughly about 72 English miles. And the Romans are putting in a mile castle every Roman mile. And between those mile castles, they're putting in 2 turrets. So the whole pattern on the wall is mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, and so on. So here we are at turret 52A. Now this tells us, given that the numbering system starts in the east and ends in the west, that we are 52 and a bit Roman miles from Wallsend over in the east, and that we've got nearly another 28 miles to get to Bowness in the west. I'm just in the doorway of turret 52A, and it's a sort of a square-built, smallish structure, essentially acting as a sort of a lookout point along the wall. And if you just look through inside, you'll see there are 2 raised hearths at the back. These would have been to keep the soldiers warm. You probably would have had about 2 stories above my head, and with a third one opening up onto a platform at the top as a lookout. And each of those levels would have been connected by a wooden ladder. You may ask why Hadrian's Wall is here at all. Well, it's here for 3 main reasons. 1, it's running across the narrowest part of the country. 2 is that it had to be north of Alston Moor, which is over on my right-hand side. Alston Moor was a very lead-rich area, and the Romans knew that. And so they came to exploit the lead, the silver and the zinc from that site, and even put a fort known as Epiarchum on the top of Alston Moor to guard those mines. So Hadrian's Wall needed to be to the north of that. And the third reason is that it was going to exploit a natural geological feature called the Wind Sill, which we'll see later on our tour. Here we are, I'm standing right next to Hadrian's Wall here, and you can see it is remarkably wide. It is about at least 8 foot, maybe up to 10 foot in places. And you might ask the question, why is it as wide as this? Well, the reason is that it probably carried a walkway. So imagine on this side, it's up to about at least 10 foot high, and on the far side, up to 15 foot high. And the 2 edges were connected by this walkway. So that, it must have been quite a substantial feature to see in the landscape at this height. Well, we looked at the structure of Hadrian's Wall along its length, so now let's turn our attention to the structure across the Hadrian's Wall. So I'm going to show you this cross-section here, and it's aligned as you see it actually in the video here. So we've got Hadrian's Wall here, there, with the higher side to the north and the slightly lower side to the south, with a walkway between the two. But to the north of us, there is a V-shaped ditch, which you can see in this illustration here. And that is going to be very prominent as we actually journey from here across to the east. Often we'll see that ditch and we won't see the wall. And it's interesting to think that the inverse structure has survived for longer than the actual upstanding wall itself. So these two were built at the same time. And you might also notice a bit of a flat area, roughly where the road is, between the wall and the ditch. And that, in the lowland areas, often found to have post holes in it. And so there may have been a thicket of sharpened staves in here, if not pits containing sharpened staves in this location here. So after the wall and the ditch were completed in around about 128 AD, the Romans decided to put in a southern defence, which is called the Vallum here. And the Vallum is quite an astonishing structure. It consists of a deep central ditch, 2 berms on either side and 2 embankments, and it can be quite wide. Its location to the wall can vary. Sometimes it runs more or less parallel to the wall and very close to it, and other times it's further away just to avoid an obstacle like a bog or a rocky hillock or something like that. So we have now, instead of having just a wall and a ditch, we now have a military zone. And the last feature to go in is the military road. Now this was a road that was put in to service the backs of the mile castles, and it ran between the Vallum and the wall here. And because it's a road, it's quite hard to identify that, but you can make out parts of it along the length of Hadrian's Wall. Earlier on I mentioned that the next structure behind me to the east would be Mile Castle 52. That is not quite strictly true, because at the top of that small rise is actually the base of a signal tower. Now this predates Hadrian's Wall. It was installed at the time when the Stone Gate was built, and the Stone Gate was the earlier Roman frontier, a Roman road, and that signal tower acted as a lookout for the Stone Gate. When Hadrian's Wall was built, the signal tower was incorporated into the line of the wall, but at 45 degrees. Well, we're at our next visible structure along Hadrian's Wall. This is turret 51B. We actually went past the site of the Mile Castle 52, but there's nothing to be seen of that. But this is the next structure we come to. And further to the east, we'll also come across turret 51A, which is about 1/3 of a mile. So very, very similar to the last turret we were at, which was 52A, square, raised hearth in the centre, more or less the same dimensions. And if you look, you can see the ditch behind this turret, and the field wall there is in line with Hadrian's Wall, so it's coming in and abutting this turret, this side and also on the far side. I'm now sitting inside turret 51A, and we've come approximately about 1/3 of a mile from 51B, which is the previous turret we stopped at. And again, just like the previous one, same shape, door still in the same place, raised hearth at the back. It still has all the elements that the other turrets have had. But I need to say that at this point, when the wall was actually built here, there was not enough stone, and so they built the wall out of turf, but the turrets and the mile castles were built in stone from the outset. And the proof of that is just over on this side of the turret here. Well, this line you can see here is where Hadrian's Wall, the stone Hadrian's Wall, is abutting the turret here. Now remember, the turret was built in stone from the outset. The wall was built out of turf initially and then replaced in stone. So this came at a later stage and was abutting the existing structure here. And our next stop, we're going to see where the stone and the turf walls diverge. So that will be our next stop. I'm standing in the platform of Mile Castle 51, which has been almost entirely robbed away. You can probably just make out some of the mounds, which are probably covering the stone walls, but most of it is gone. So Mile Castle 51, another 1/3 of a mile from turret 51A, which we saw earlier on. Mile Castle 51 is quite an interesting site because behind me, this is where the stone wall and the turf wall diverge, or you could argue converge, whichever way you look at it. So it's at this point here that the stone wall was, when they rebuilt the turf wall in stone, they didn't do that in this place. For some reason they decided to place the stone wall a little to the north of the turf wall. And so behind me you can see a ditch, which is the north ditch of the turf wall, with the turf wall just to the south of that. Well, from this section here, we have the two lines. We have the turf wall and the stone wall running parallel to each other and not actually coming back together again until we get to Harrow Scar, which is to the east of Bird Oswald. And both the turf wall and the stone wall have their own turrets, so it would be the turf wall turrets and the stone wall turrets, and the stone wall mile castles and the turf wall mile castle. Well, hello again, and here we are at Bird Oswald this time, and I'm standing outside the east gate of Bird Oswald here, and this is probably the finest example of a gateway in any fort along Hadrian's Wall. So you can see that it's a double arched entrance, and each entrance originally would have had two doors opening inwards here. However, at some point the northern gateway was blocked up to create a second guard room here. And it's on this line that the turf wall originally passed through this fort here. If you remember when we were at Wall Bowers, we discussed about the divergence of the stone wall and the turf wall. And the divergence happened because the stone wall needed to move to the north. And here we are, the turf wall came through the middle of Bird Oswald and continues in an easterly direction. And the stone wall now goes to the north. So that's what we've got here. And I'm going to compare this particular image with one that was an engraving that was done in 1852, and you'll see that the two views have hardly changed at all. So you'll see behind me, you'll see the base stone forming the bottom part of the arch of the northern gateway here, and that is the only example that there is along the wall in one of the forts. Well, here we have a particularly fine example of a drainage channel, and that was put in by the Romans because presumably this area here was quite boggy, quite wet, and they needed to drain it away from the wall. Hence why it's here. Well, we're here at just to the east of Bird Oswald, and it's a particularly fine section of continuous original wall here. And this wall is continuous to Harrow Scar Mile Castle, which is where we're going to be going in a short while. But it contains two features of interest, one of which is more or less directly opposite where I'm standing. And here, built into the wall, is a very fine phallic symbol here. And you may wonder why such a thing actually is on the wall, and it's because the soldiers regarded the phallus as protection against the evil eye, and the evil eye represents all sorts of dangers that there might be out there beyond the wall. And you can see this one is actually on the southern side of the wall, and the dangers would be to the north beyond here. And in fact, this is not the only phallic symbol on this section. There is another one further down which we'll also see. So we could regard this as sort of the willy walk along the wall. Well, here we are at our second phallic symbol. Here it is, here, and it's pointing the same way as the other one, i.e. to the west. We're here at Mile Castle 49, otherwise known as Harrow Scar. And this is, you can see I'm standing on the wide width of the western wall of the Mile Castle, wide because they would have taken a walkway around the inside of the Mile Castle itself. But the rest of it has been knocked about a bit. You'll see there's a farm track coming right through it, and the remains behind me are of a later building. So it's not the best example of a Mile Castle that I can show you. However, it does demonstrate one interesting thing, and that's if we look westwards, you'll see that the wall is going straight, and then suddenly the wall begins to deviate towards the north. And that is because it's at this point where the turf wall and the stone wall deviate once again. We saw that at Wall Bowers, and here's the other end of it. So originally, the wall here would have been built on top of the turf wall. The turf wall then continued in a straight line, heading towards that east gateway that we saw at Bird Oswald. And then you'll also see that the stone wall then begins to deviate away, so that it's actually then making contact with the north wall of the fort itself. I'm standing in the southern entrance or exit from the Mile Castle here, and people would pass through and then descend a steep slope in order to go down into the valley of the River Irthing, and that's exactly where we're going to go next, except we're not going to follow this route, we're going to follow the farm track to get there. Well, I'm just standing on the edge of the Willowford Bridge here, a modern bridge which goes over the River Irthing. It was installed in 1999 and had to be sort of airlifted into place section by section by helicopter. And it's a very fine piece of engineering, and we get a better view of it from the other side of the river. Well, from this very fine modern structure that we've just walked over, we're just going to walk on a few hundred yards to get to something that's much older than this. I'm just standing on the pier of the Roman bridge here at Willowford. We just crossed over a modern bridge, and here we are at this bridge, which was constructed about 1900 years ago when the wall was being built. And back in that day, there would have been water rushing through on either side. I would have been surrounded by water, but there's no water now. This bridge is isolated inland because the river has moved to the west, leaving these bridge abutments just isolated on dry land. There have been 3 bridges in this location over the Roman period of time, and the first one was just a simple bridge that was carrying the wall over the River Irthing with a turret at either side, and one of those turrets was probably in the area that I'm actually standing in here. The second bridge was possibly a timber constructed bridge rather than the stone bridge of the first one, and this time they move the tower further in. You can see this structure here with the central pillar is probably where that turret was. And this time we have a bridge supported by wooden struts, which we'll see in a moment. And we've also got the 2 sluices that were inserted at that point, probably because there might have been a mill here or possibly a smithy, both of which would have needed water nearby. The third phase of development here was necessary in order to carry the military road over the river, and that necessitated widening the bridge. So the military road came up here, so they basically demolished this turret to bring the military road up on a ramp here, adjacent to the wall, and then across the river that way. Right, I'm here to look at some of the detail of the second bridge, the one that had the timber construction. Because here you'll see a square socket hole here, and there's another one there. And they would have held square supports, posts, that would then have in themselves supported sort of a trellis system to carry the wall over the river here. And there's also other features of interest. You'll see on this far side, this triangular shape here. That matches another one on this side, and that would again probably been where sort of triangular supports would have been put through here. And on the top you'll see we've got these sort of wedge-shaped depressions here, and there's several of those. There's another one there, and they were probably another one here in fact, though missing on this one here. And they would have been where the masons would have cut these. I believe they're called masons' dogs, but don't quote me on that. They would have been filled with sort of molten lead or molten iron to bind the stones together to keep them in place. And the third feature we've got of interest here is this slit here. Now this is a Lewis hole, and it was cut by the stonemasons either to lift a block of stone out of a quarry or to actually put it into position. So what the masons would do, they'd cut this slit, this wedge, and it's angled backwards on either side. You can see my fingers going in at an angle like that. And this was designed to take something called a Lewis key. Now a Lewis key had 3 parts to it. The 2 outer parts were shaped like a wedge and the central one was straight. So you put the 2 outer pieces in first with the wedge shape, and then you drive down the central one and it forces the 2 wedge shapes to either side. So now you created a lock. And then from the Lewis key, then you attach it to a hoist, and you're ready then using a crane to actually lever this piece of stone into position. And that's how the Romans actually, in this particular instance, got these stones into where they were needed. The wall was built in sections by cohorts of men, all working at the same time. And every now and then what you get is a centurial stone built into the wall, which records that particular cohort or century of men actually constructed that section of the wall. Now these are highly prized, and they often find their way into other buildings, as is the case here. So if you just look here, this is a centurial stone right there. And it actually says it is the 5th cohort from the century of Gellius Philippus, who built that particular section. So in a way, it's accountability. He's actually saying to the general of Britain, or even the emperor himself, which actual person was in charge of building that section of wall. I'm standing within turret 48B, and in effect this is about 1/3 of a mile from Harriscar Mile Castle, which is over on the west side there. And this is a section of wall where we get a mile castle and 2 turrets and another mile castle all within the same section, and that's quite a rare thing to find on the wall. I'm at the far side of the turret here, on the eastern side, and this here is what we call the wing wall to do with that turret. But here, the bit I'm standing on, you'll see I'm standing on a low structure here. Now, what's happened here, what we've got here are the foundation stones, which run the full width of the wall. And then we get the wall, which has been set back. Now, this is because Hadrian came to inspect progress on the wall around about 122 AD, and he thought work was progressing too slowly, and then ordered that the wall be narrowed in order to quicken the whole process up. So here we have, the foundation stones were laid down first, but he's ordered the wall to be built back from that. So in this instance, we're getting narrow wall on the broad foundation. I'm standing outside turret 48A, which is the next turret in our sequence. Remember, we went to Harriscar Mile Castle, which is Mile Castle 49, and then turret 48B, this is turret 48A, and our next stop will be at Mile Castle 48, otherwise known as Poulter's Burn. And that will complete our sequence of Mile Castle, turret, Mile Castle, all of which are visible and remain to this day. I'm standing in the southern gateway of Poulter's Burn Mile Castle, which is Mile Castle number 48. And it's a large Mile Castle, this one, and quite well preserved. And it's got a couple of features of interest, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just to say here, we've got the south entrance, which has been partly blocked up, and behind me are 2 rows of barracks with a central sort of roadway between them. So goods and people will be passing through from underneath the north gate, the gateway with the tower on top, through the central and through the southern gateway, and then over the vallum. Well, behind me you can see there are 2 rows of barracks. and they would have probably housed about up to 30 men here. And between the barracks there is a central roadway, and this would be the way by which people and their goods would be passing through this Mile Castle from one side of the wall to the other. And on that way through they will be searched, they'll be vetted, they will be taxed, any goods they were bringing through by the soldiers, and then they would proceed through the South Gateway over the Vallum, and then they were free. So here we have a series of ovens here built into the northwest corner of this Mile Castle. You can see the first one here, and then there are layers of ovens on top of that. So this is unusually actually where soldiers will be baking their bread and cooking various items. Often these ovens though are outside the Mile Castle for fear of fire, whereas here it's actually inside the Mile Castle. Well, here we have an unusual feature. We've got a series of steps here. And they think that these would have led up onto the walkway, which had been all the way around the inside of this Mile Castle. And from these few steps here, they can extrapolate and work out that that walkway is probably about 12 foot high where the steps ended. Well, this is where we're going to end our day, exploring this section of wall between Birdoswald and Poulterous Burn. So please join us next time when we're going to go to the Wartown Crags and have a look at what we can find there. Well, this is the Wartown Quarry, which was set up in about 1876, because if you just look behind me, you'll see the wind sill, which is made of dolerite, and dolerite makes very good building stone. So the Victorians were here in 1876, quarrying away Hadrian's Wall. So you'll see over to the far side, you'll see Hadrian's Wall, and it's suddenly just truncated as the quarry takes over. And the quarry here was operating for 100 years before finally closing in 1976. We're walking around the side of the quarry now into a wonderful wildflower meadow here, and it's just gorgeous. It's awash with orchids and daisies and buttercups and all sorts of flowers. However, it wasn't always like this. This was a quarry floor because we're way down below what the original surface was. But we're going to head up, and if you can see it just behind me, up to the top of the crags where Hadrian's Wall is. So just bear in mind, everything you see here is artificial and man-made, and Hadrian's Wall would have been above our heads at this point. Okay, well, we've climbed up the quarry crag up onto Hadrian's Wall itself. I'm actually standing on Hadrian's Wall, and it would have continued if I just turned sideways over that way. It curves over to the left, and if we just look over this field wall, this quarry wall, you'll see what's happened to Hadrian's Wall. You'll see that Hadrian's Wall just falls off a quarry face just right here. But we do know that it must have curved round to the right in a sweeping curve over towards that hill and then heading towards Carlisle in that direction. And at some point in this quarry there was a turret, and it was turret 45B, and it was said to be one of the highest standing turrets along the wall, but sadly was dynamited away by the Victorians. Well, I'm here, I'm sitting on the wall, on Hadrian's Wall, and we're on a slope, quite a sort of a significant slope. And if you just look, you'll see the wall stones are flowing down the slope here. Any self-respecting stonemason or waller would have stepped the wall down at this point, but here the Romans are actually letting it flow down, relying on the strength of their mortar to keep the wall together. However, they do occasionally also step the wall down in places, but here is a good example of the flow of Hadrian's Wall. So if we look closely at the building of Hadrian's Wall, you will see here we've got lovely chunky facing stones here which have been square cut, and we've got an unassorted arrangement of any old stones in the centre. This is the infill material here. So all they're doing is they're dressing the facing stone and putting anything they can find in the middle, and they're building the wall up course by course. Whenever they build a course up, they infill it then with mortar. This is what the Romans have invented. And the facing stones are generally chamfered, so they chamfered inwards like this one here is, and that is to provide a key for that mortar to hold the wall together. And this is the factor why the Romans can allow the wall to flow down a slope like this, because they're relying on the strength of that mortar to hold it together. Well, we're at an interesting section of wall here. You'll see Hadrian's Wall is making a distinct change of direction here, and the lower courses are dovetailed in, as you can see. And then when you get to this one, the stonemasons have actually cut this stone to follow the direction of the wall, which is a neat idea here. Also, these big blocks, which we discussed before, are not made of dolerite. The local stone here, the bedrock of dolerite, is far too hard to actually have a cleavage plane. It can't be dressed. And so what they're using here is a hard grey sandstone, which they brought in from elsewhere. Well, here you can quite easily see the full width of Hadrian's Wall behind me, which is about 8 foot wide or so. And in some places it is narrower than this, but here we are having full width of 8 foot. And even further in the distance, you'll see it's actually even wider than that, where it's been widened to actually probably go around some hard boulders which are in the way. So here we are, one of many drainage ditches which are put in underneath the wall, and that's because this area around here would have been very wet, very marshy, so the drainage hole has gone in to drain the water out under the wall. Here Hadrian's Wall has got a distinct bulge on it here, as you can see, and that's probably because within that there are boulders, because looking around me we've got a hard band of rock here and they've been incorporated into the wall, and you have to have the bulge in order to hold the whole thing together here. And to create this bulge they've actually stepped the wall down, you can see in phases like that, so it's rather than just being flush, it's actually stepped up here. Well, here we are at a beautiful section of original wall, which is in this sort of serpentine shape along here. And it is probably one of the highest sections of Hadrian's Wall that still exists. Here I'm standing in front of a section of wall which is above my head, and I'm about 5'7", 5'8", so the wall itself would probably be somewhere up there on this side. That's around about 10 foot high on this side, and on the far side even higher still, another 5 foot higher, rising to about 15 foot. And then the wall is quite wide because between the inner and the outer edge there would have been a walkway, and that explains the width of the wall. So here I am at this section, and there are actually going to be at least 12 courses from the bottom here to the top. So here you might wonder why such an intact section of wall exists, and it probably is because there are no buildings near here for which they would have taken the stone away to build, and it's hidden behind these crags as well. So we have got this wonderful sinuous section of wall still intact to a considerable height. You might also want to look at the flora on the wall. We've got these sort of lovely little ferns here which have got a foothold in the mortar of the wall here and are thriving in these conditions. Well, this section here, you can see a large quantity of the facing stones have gone here, down to this course here, just leaving behind all this assorted mishmash of infill stone here. So this is all gone for building stone elsewhere here. Well, contrary to what we saw earlier on when the wall was flowing down a slope, here we've got the wall stepping down the slope. And it may be that the slope is too steep for the wall to flow down it here, or it may be that a different cohort of soldiers were building this section in a different way. Every section of wall was built by a group of men, and when they'd finished that section, they'd put in what we call a centurial stone built into the fabric of the wall, recording who had built that section. Well, you can see here how they put in a wedge-shaped piece of stone, just try and level up the courses here. There's one there, there's another one here. So in this particular section, they're trying to keep the courses relatively horizontal and then stepping it down at intervals. Well, here I am inside turret 45A on Hadrian's Wall, and this actually is older than Hadrian's Wall. This predates Hadrian's Wall by about 20-30 years or so. This was a freestanding lookout tower that was part of the Staingate system of forts, which is to the south of where we're standing here. And when Hadrian's Wall was built in 122 AD, then they incorporated this turret into the line of the wall, as you can see on both sides of me here. So here's the proof that this tower is pre-existing on Hadrian's Wall, because you can see the line where Hadrian's Wall had to abut the existing structure of the turret here. So there it is running straight up, and the same on the other side. Well, here I've walked down Hadrian's Wall. I'm standing on a grassy mound now. Hadrian's Wall is underneath my feet. And if you just look behind me, what we have is another Victorian quarry, which once again has taken a bite out of Hadrian's Wall, though this time a much smaller bite than the first quarry we saw. And Hadrian's Wall then does reappear on the far side of the quarry and then continues up those crags behind me. So here you can probably see how Hadrian's Wall is exploiting the escarpment ridge of the Great Wind Sill. Although a quarry has taken a bite out of it, in the far distance you can see Hadrian's Wall coming back into view again, and it's right on the edge of that escarpment ridge. So there's a precipitous drop just to the north of it, and this is a naturally defensive location. At this point here there's no need for a north ditch. Hadrian's Wall just follows the crags as close as it can, up and down for as long as it possibly can. Well, hello, we're at Caulfields now, and behind me is another quarry. If you remember last time we were at Wartown Crags, which was a huge quarry where they've taken away Hadrian's Wall to try and get the dolerite underneath that. And once again here at Caulfields we've got exactly the same thing. You can see this is dolerite, they're taking it out, they're crushing it for roadstone. We know this quarry was operating in 1902 and probably before that, and it finally closed in 1936. So if you just look ahead, you'll see there's a small hillock, and Hadrian's Wall runs to the top of that hillock. And just to the left-hand side of that hillock, there is a mile castle, which is where we're going to go to next. Okay, well here we are at the south entrance of this rather large Roman structure, which is called a mile castle. And it's called a mile castle because these structures were placed every Roman mile along the wall. And the Roman mile is slightly shorter than English mile. English mile we all know is 1,760 yards, and a Roman mile is about 1,600 yards or so. So these mile castles placed every Roman mile, and in effect they were the means by which people and goods could move from beyond the wall to this side of the wall. You couldn't pass through a turret and you couldn't pass through a fort. It was the mile castles. So we can actually think of them as checkpoints in effect. So it really implies that Hadrian's Wall, when it was built, isn't a barrier, as many people like to think, but it's more a frontier zone, a frontier control zone that was controlling the passage of people through the wall. Well, I'm standing in the gateway of this mile castle, which is Mile Castle 42, and I'll tell you more about that in a little while. And we're going to walk up that slope, which is quite steep and quite rocky, to the north gateway. Phew, that was a bit of an uphill climb, and it must have been so for the soldiers living here about 1900 years ago. There would have been about 20 to 30 men living in this mile castle, and they would have been in barracks. And you can see with the slope, the steep slope and the rocky nature of the terrain, it must have been quite a challenge to actually live in these barracks. So they must have been sort of raised up on stilts and levelled up that way. Well, I'm standing in the north gateway of Mile Castle 42, and there would have been double doors here. You can see the pivot holes, one there and one here, so we know where the doors were positioned, and they would have opened inwards into the Mile Castle. And I also want to draw your attention to the monumental stonework that we got here, which is very similar to the south gateway. But what we have got here, we can clearly see the so-called scoring lines. So if we zoom in, you'll see here on this stone here, we have a scored line here and another one along here. And they were done by stonemasons to tell the builders where to put the next stone because it was set back. You can see we got a step up here, another step, and then from this point onwards, the stonework would have been straight up at this point here. Well, we talked earlier on about mile castles being every Roman mile. And this one is actually not quite in its actual measured location. It should be another sort of 20, 25 metres to the east of here. And the question is, why was it not placed there? Why was it placed here instead? Well, we earlier mentioned that mile castles acted as control points, checkpoints, and that people needed to access both sides of the mile castle, in fact. So further up to the east, there was a precipice. There's no way that people could actually physically get up to that point. Whereas here, if we just look round behind me, you could imagine a sort of a switchback road coming up the slope here and heading into the mile castle here. So it's probably put here for convenience sake. Well, here we just climbed to the top of a nearby hill and we got a wonderful view looking down on that mile castle that we just visited it. And you can see it's roughly square in shape, and it's got very wide walls, as wide as Hadrian's Wall in fact, and rounded corners, very much like a miniature Roman fort. And the reason why those walls are so thick is because it probably carried a walkway, just like Hadrian's Wall did as well. And remember we discussed mile castles being every Roman mile, and there are 80 of them along the wall. So Mile Castle 42 is more or less in the centre of the wall, and it seems to have been a centre of operations because to the north and south of where we are there are numerous camps, and these were camps for stonemasons. So it was in this area that they were quarrying stone and then dressing the face in stones and then transporting those stones to the east and the west along Hadrian's Wall. Well, here at the top of this hillock we've got a fantastic view looking eastwards, and you're looking across the whole of the military zone. So behind me you can see Hadrian's Wall on the left, you can see the Mile Castle there too. And then on the right hand side you'll see some parallel lines, and this marks the line of the vallum. But the vallum is a substantial structure that's essentially a deep ditch flanked on either side by embankments. And we don't really know why the vallum was put in, but it's likely that it was providing a southern demarcation to create a military zone, as it were, rather than just having the wall. Or it might have been put in to prevent any possible incursions and attacks coming from the south. Well, this is a cross-section across the military zone of Hadrian's Wall, and you can see on this side, we haven't got the ditch here by the way because we've got a precipice instead, but you can see Hadrian's Wall there, and you can see the vallum on this side here. And then in between the two there is the military road. Now the military road came in after both the wall and the vallum, so the order of construction is Hadrian's Wall first, vallum second, and then the military road came third. And the proof of that is right here. So the military road is the last Roman feature to be installed on Hadrian's Wall, and it follows the base of the slope behind me, and its purpose was to service the mile castles and the forts along Hadrian's Wall, and it always keeps to the south of Hadrian's Wall. So you can see here it has to make a turn to come round Hadrian's Wall, and there it runs into a problem. The problem is the vallum. The military road has swung round to avoid this hill here, and it's run into the vallum. And this really proves that the military road was conceived of after the vallum was constructed, because if they knew they were going to put a military road in, they would have moved the vallum a bit further to the south to allow enough space for the military road to go in. As it currently stands, what's happened is that the military road has run into the vallum, it's got nowhere to go, so it uses the north mound or the north embankment of the vallum and runs along that for a few yards before coming off it. We're standing here on the ditch of the vallum, which is stretching away behind me to the east, a very fine cross-section through the vallum. And you can see there's a central main ditch, there's two what we call berms, which are flat areas on either side of that ditch, and then two mounds, the north mound and the south mound. A wonderful view of the vallum, but spin round to look to the west and it's completely gone. Absolutely gone. It's been ploughed out and levelled up, and there's absolutely no trace of the vallum whatsoever. Right behind me you might spot two standing stones, one small, one large, known as the Mare and the Foal. And those standing stones are far older than Hadrian's Wall. They must be about 5,000 years old, and they were here when Hadrian's Wall was being built. So it must be remarkable for those, because they'll be highly visible to the builders on the wall at that point. It seems that there would have been a small circle here of around about 12, maybe 15 stones, and only two are now upright, with a third one which is lying down. And the circle would have been about 6 metres in diameter. Well, we're here at Core Gap, which is about a mile east of Caulfield's Mile Castle, where we've just been, and I brought you here to show you the re-emergence of the ditch. So the ditch is on my left-hand side. You can see it as a very clear V-shaped notch in the landscape. It's been put back here because this land is quite low, therefore it is vulnerable, and the Romans are actually creating that ditch as an extra barrier, an extra protection in front of the wall itself. And over on my right is the wall coming through at this point here. And in front of me are the Windshield Crags, and for our next visit we're going to be going over the Windshield Crags to Steel Rig, and you'll be able to join us at that point there. Right, hello, well thank you for joining me once again on our journey of discovery along Hadrian's Wall, looking at the less known features along Hadrian's Wall. So we're here at Steel Rig, and we're going to be doing this section between Steel Rig and Sycamore Gap. not very far, only about a mile or so along the wall, but full of lots of interesting features. So here, steel rig, one of the classic viewpoints of Hadrian's Wall. Just look at that view behind me, with the wall stretching ahead over the windsill, clambering up and down the windsill, heading towards Housesteads and beyond to the east. A magnificent view, fantastic when the sun is setting at the end of the day in particular. But there are some differences here to what we saw earlier on our earlier visit to Caulfields. And the one major difference, is the wall here on my left. Well, I'm standing next to Hadrian's Wall right here, but it's very different to the wall we saw at Caulfields on our previous section. This is very different in many ways. One, it's same height. Two is that there's turf on the top of it. And three is that there's no mortar binding these stones together. It's essentially a dry wall. And you may ask, well, why is there a difference between these two types of wall, original and rebuilt wall in effect? And it all comes down to one man who's called John Clayton. John Clayton lived from the sort of late 18th century right up to about 1890. And so he was a Victorian. And his father lived at Chester's House, which is next to Chester's Fort. And John eventually inherited that estate. Now, unlike his father, John had a great interest in the wall and basically on his father's lawn, and he wanted to dig to see what was beneath the surface, which he started to do. And he developed a really strong passion for the wall and all its treasures. So as he inherited the estate, he had enough money then to buy up plots of land containing the wall, as well as the forts as well. And once he'd done that, he then began to sort of excavate and find all these treasures. And over time, he accumulated a vast treasure trove of artifacts, including altars and statues and inscriptions, many of which now are on display in the John Clayton Museum at Chester's Fort. Well, John Clayton lived at a time when the Victorians were almost actively destroying the wall. They were either quarrying it away or they were taking it away for new building. Now, John, essentially, by buying up land containing the wall, was protecting it. He stopped that quarrying taking place, and he forbade the taking away of the stones for building new buildings as well. And he also would move buildings that are actually on the wall or some of its features to another location. So by doing so, he effectively was protecting the wall and its features, and he is regarded as the man who saved the wall. We're here at a location called Peel Gap, and you can see there's sort of a natural valley just behind me here with Hadrian's Wall on either side of that. Now, there was a problem here for the Romans. There was a turret over on that headland there, which was turret 39A, and another turret over on this side at turret 39B. And both those turrets were so far away from this central area that neither of them could adequately monitor what was happening in this gap. Now, we know that the pattern of the Roman structures was mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, turret, turret, mile castle, and so on. And so the archaeologists were not expecting to find anything unusual here, but that's exactly what they found in 1987. It's astonishing to think that the turret at the bottom of here was only discovered in 1987, after all those centuries. And it's probably because the archaeologists didn't expect to find a third turret here. And the reason why it wasn't there was because it's completely covered over in grass, mud, silt, whatever, for centuries, and so it was hidden from view, so nobody knew it was there. And if you do look closer at the bottom of the hill here, you see its original wall has come back in again, because that was all below the surface at one point and therefore hidden from view. So Peel Gap Turret is at the bottom of this valley, so let's go down and have a look at it. Well, I'm here at the bottom of Peel Gap. So before we climb up, I just want to show you the wall here, original wall, and the turret beyond it. and now I'm going to climb up this rock staircase to the top of the crags. We've just climbed up onto the crags, and here I am sitting on Hadrian's Wall, and I'm surrounded by a wonderful assemblage of flora here. So just next to me I've got ladies' bed straw here, so called because it was used to sort of soften the mattresses that ladies slept in. And then just beyond that we've got harebells here, the beautiful deep blue of the harebells, and there's many other wildflowers all around me here. We're back on the rebuilt wall again, and if you look behind me you can see the full width of Hadrian's Wall, but part of the rebuilt wall is only on this side, which extends a little bit higher than behind it. We're here at Mile Castle 39 on Hadrian's Wall. If you remember, we were at Caulfield's, Mile Castle 42. So this is another 3 Roman miles on from Caulfield's to the east. And this Mile Castle is not in its true measured position once again. And that's because it lies in a dip. This is called Castle Nick. And therefore Mile Castles acting as checkpoints where people could pass through. It needed to be somewhere where people could pass through it. And that's exactly what you have here. So not only did this Mile Castle have to be down in a dip to allow people and goods to pass through the wall, it also had to maintain signalling with Barkham Hill behind me. There was a major Roman signal station on there communicating to a wide arc of Hadrian's Wall, and this was just one of the Mile Castles communicating with that signal station. I'm standing in the north gateway of this Mile Castle. It would have been an arch above me, double doors, and a tower above all that. And there are still the socket holes for those doors still in place, one on that side and one at that side. And if you look behind me, we're down in this dip, so this is, people and goods could easily just come up, presumably by pack animal, and then come through this Mile Castle. So inside this Mile Castle, there are the remains of the barrack blocks that would have supported anywhere between 20 and 30 soldiers here. The previous Mile Castle, Caulfield's, had no indication of the barracks here, but we do have that here. And the soldiers would have been given a daily ration of grain, which they would grind to make flour, and then they would bake it in an oven outside the Mile Castle. I'm here sitting on the wall at the top of another so-called nick, and in the bottom of this nick, or gap if you like, is a rather special tree. It's a sycamore tree, and it is wonderfully framed by the Hadrian's Wall on either side of it. And so this area is known as Sycamore Gap, and it is well photographed, much loved, and it probably is one of the most photographed locations in the whole of the UK, in fact. And the tree itself was actually voted Tree of the Year in the UK in 2016. Well, here I am under the spreading boughs of a sycamore tree, and this is the sycamore tree that was made famous in the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner. And it was here that Kevin Costner, aka Robin Hood, came across Sir Guy Gisborne, who had trapped a little boy up this tree who had been accused of stealing a deer or something like that. So it's a film location spot, and it's a place where people just love to come and sit and enjoy the shade and then admire the view of the tree from the south. We've just walked a few yards to the south of Sycamore Gap in order to appreciate the fine view that we get from here. You can see the tree, and it's very clearly framed by the slope on either side. Hadrian's Wall is coming down at that point, behind the tree, and then up the other side. It is this classic, iconic view which you see everywhere. The next section that we're going to be covering will be from Brockalicia, otherwise known as Carraborough, towards Chesters. And for now, I cannot think of a finer place to end this particular section of Hadrian's Wall. So, until next time. I'm standing to the south of the fort of Brockalicia, otherwise known as Carraborough, on Hadrian's Wall. And over on my right-hand side, you can see the corner of this fort, the southwest corner of it. Now, we know the fort was probably put in around about sort of the 130s AD by a cohort of Tungrians, and the Tungrians are from modern-day Belgium. And we know later on it was also occupied by a cohort of Batavians from the sort of Dutch Rhineland area. And we know they were here because they put altars up in a nearby temple. And that is where we're going to go to next. Behind me is a Mithraic temple here. And it was discovered in 1949. There'd been a drought that year, and the ground had shrunk, revealing the tops of the three altars. So they realised there was something here, and then dug down to reveal the rest of the temple that they could see here. Well, Mithraism is a very ancient religion, and quite a secretive one at that. It was highly popular amongst Roman soldiers here. No women were actually allowed in these temples at all. Now, a Mithraic temple, unlike many Roman temples, was designed to look like a cave and was often underground for that reason. So let's go and have a closer look at this temple. On either side of the temple, there would be stone benches on which the cult's members would recline during their meetings. And you can see at the very end, there are two statues, one of which is only the feet remains. Now, these are statues to Cortes and Cortopartes. But only Cortes on the right-hand side survives, but minus his head. In front, there is a vestibule, often called a narthex, which was separated from the main body of the temple by a timber screen. And it seems that it was in this area where various initiation rites were conducted, completion of which allowed the worshippers to move to the next grade. Now, these trials were a sort of series of physical, spiritual trials by fire, by water, heat, cold, fasting, and something called journeying. So highly popular among Roman soldiers who were invited to join a Mithraic cult, and they had to sort of go through these various trials in order to rise through the various levels. We have 3 altars here, each of which was dedicated by a prefect of the first cohort of Batavians. If you recall, Batavians are from the sort of Dutch Rhine Delta area, in fact. And the one over here on my right has got 3 holes pierced into it, and there was a recess at the back, and it seems that there would have been a lamp or a candle or something like that put at the back of here, allowing the light to shine through these holes and thus illuminating the whole impact of this particular altar here. Behind me, though, is also a shelf which would have held something called the tauroctony. At the back of all Mithraic temples was something called a tauroctony. Now, this usually takes the form of a carved relief and depicts a variety of figures, animals and scenes, all of which appear in any tauroctony anywhere within the Roman world. Centre stage is the god Mithra or Mithras, the god of the cosmos, and he's always shown grasping a bull's head and plunging a knife into its shoulder. And other creatures can be identified here. There is a dog and a snake, both leaping up to sort of lick the bull's blood. There's a raven and a scorpion. And in the top left-hand corner can be seen the sun god pulling a chariot bearing the sun. And in the opposite corner is the moon goddess. You may also spot the 2 characters called Cortes and Cortopartes, who also appear in this temple. And they hold torches. One has the torch held up, the other has the torch held down, and this may signify life and death. So what does it all mean? Various theories have been put forward to explain the tauroctony, the elements of a tauroctony, but one of the most compelling is that it possibly represents a fusion of astrology and astronomy. During Roman times, it was believed that the earth was fixed at the centre of the universe, and around it moved the stars and the sun. And the sun was actually moving in front of the various constellations, creating the zodiac with which we're all familiar. But there was also another celestial equator on a different plane with its own constellations. And these were, in order, Taurus, the bull, Canis Minor, the dog, Hydra, the snake, Corvus, the raven, and Scorpio, the scorpion, all of which appear on a tauroctony. Now, these 2 spheres, the zodiac sphere and the celestial equator, intersect with each other at the equinoxes. That's the spring and the autumn equinox. And however, those 2 points of intersection are not fixed and move slowly over time from one constellation to the next, moving backwards through the zodiac, a process that takes nearly 2,600 years. So, if you can remember this, more than 4,000 years ago, the spring equinox was in the constellation of Taurus. Around 2,000 years ago, it had moved into Aries, represented by the ram. Today, the spring equinox is in the constellation of Pisces, and in a few hundred years, it will appear in the constellation of Aquarius, the so-called dawning of the age of Aquarius. Therefore, does the tauroctony symbolise the end of the age of Taurus by the all-powerful god of the universe, Mithras, who is also often seen to be holding a cosmic sphere in one hand while his other hand rotates the circle of the zodiac. This Mithraeum was abandoned and demolished by the early 4th century. Its statues were broken and the tauroctony removed altogether, and this may have been possibly done by Christians. Over time, the Mithraeum became submerged beneath the peat and vanished from view until 1949. Well, behind me is Coventina's Well. This is just a few metres upstream from the Mithraic temple that we've just been to. Now, Coventina's Well was obviously a shrine dedicated to the water goddess, Coventina, and it probably has been of significance even pre-Roman times. because when it was excavated in 1875, it was found to contain a huge number of votive objects, including more than 13,000 coins, just coins. And many of the other objects have been put on display at the Clayton Museum, which is part of Chester's Roman fort. At some point, the well was deliberately blocked to conceal it from Christianizing influences. And that blocking resulted in this very shallow valley becoming flooded and the development of peat, which then in turn helped towards the preservation of the Mithraic temple. Coventina's well was excavated by a chap called John Clayton. Now, John Clayton is very key to the whole history of Hadrian's Wall. He was the son of a wealthy banker who had bought Chester's house, which lies in front of Chester's Roman fort. Now, on inheriting his father's house, John set about excavating the fort. He then began to buy plots of land containing sections of Hadrian's Wall to prevent further robbing and quarrying, which was rampant during Victorian times. So by doing so, he's actually regarded as the man who saved the wall. And at Chester's Fort, there is a small museum called the Clayton Museum, which is full of the various objects and artefacts and votive offerings that were actually found in Coventine as well. Right, we're here at Limestone Corner now, and you can see over here is the North Ditch, and it's running up behind me. And you can see there's some massive blocks of rock as well. And it's here that the Romans encountered a problem. At this point here, the windsill, the dolerite, is extremely hard. So the Romans had a real tough time in trying to sort of dig it out of the ditch here. And when we're going to go up a little bit further, we'll see where they actually abandoned the attempt and the ditch remains unfinished. By contrast though, the vallum, which is over on my left hand side, was dug through this dolerite a few years later. I'm here standing in the North Ditch, and looking around, I'm surrounded by huge blocks of stone. You can see here, this is a cut edge of the ditch here, and they've taken out huge blocks of stone and literally just thrown them onto the embankment here on the south side. Well, this block of stone represents a moment in time when the Romans gave up. They were defeated by the hardness of this rock. You can see in this stone here, we've got wedges. There are many of them here. And this is where the Romans are driving in sort of a metal tipped wedge along thin quartz veins. Here's one running through here in order to try and split this rock apart. But they failed. They gave up. And an order must have come from above to say, stop work, down tools, we're not going to do this any longer. And if you just look then behind me, you'll see that the ditch literally just fizzles out to the east. I'm standing inside Black Cart's turret, which is turret 29A on Hadrian's Wall, and it has been severely robbed. However, the back wall stands about 11 courses high here, and we have the entrance right here, and you can see that there are the grooves for the door jambs on either side, and a channel here where the door would have been brought in to hang on its pivot at that point there. I'm standing near the end of the Roman bridge abutments at Chester's, and just across the river is Chester's bathhouse. Now, there were two bridges at this point here. The first bridge was built simply to carry the wall across the river, and it consisted of sort of 9 arches and a walkway across the top. Then, when the military road was built, they had to widen that bridge in order to carry the road across it too. So the old bridge was taken down, and a new bridge of just 4 arches was inserted in place of it. Okay, I'm standing here on the bridge, And I've got evidence here for the first bridge that carried Hadrian's Wall over the river, and it's right here. This is the footings of one of the earlier pillars. Remember, there were 8 or 9 arches over the river at this point, and this is the pier for one of those arches. And then this would have been taken down, and 4 larger arches were put in afterwards. Behind me, there is this wall here, which is a tower at the end of the bridge, and there would have been one on the other side. And the other feature to note are the sort of splayed walls here and here. And these are put in to sort of reinforce the bridge end here, to deflect flood water, and also to prevent backscouring by the river as well. So here we have another fine phallus. If you remember, we met these actually built into the wall just to the east of Bird Oswald, and another one is here for exactly the same reason. It's to ward off danger, ward off the evil eye, and that's why we have it at the lowest course of the bridge abutment here. So once again, just as at Willeford Bridge, we've got the same features. We've got this sort of dovetail clamping here, and we've also got Lewis holes here and here. So Lewis holes would have been used to contain a Lewis key, which would have brought that piece of stone into position there. And the clamps here are to actually pull the stones together. So they'd be cut by the mason, and then a piece of sort of slightly warm iron would have been hammered into that place, and then lead would be poured in to seal the joint. Well, here we have a column, and they think that these columns are actually up on the parapet of the bridge, and you can see this sort of protruding boss. The whole thing looks a bit like a torpedo, really. This would have been possibly holding a statue, so this would have been upright with a statue on top. On the bank over there are various stones, many of which have been dredged out of the river over the previous decades, including another one of the columns. I'm sitting in the remains of a massive water channel which goes behind me and through the turret and comes in from the far side there. And what we can see here is one of the coping stones over this channel. Many of them are collapsed, as you can see behind me. We don't really know what this channel was for, but it's obviously bringing water through, so it's possible there may have been an as yet undiscovered mill somewhere in this vicinity. Well, this is St Giles's Church at Chorlton, and you can see it is primarily a Victorian rebuild. But we're going to go inside where we're going to see something much older than that. Well, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pillars, Roman pillars, which have probably come from the fort at Chester's. And here they are holding up the south aisle of the nave at St Giles's Church. So what we have here is a font that's been created out of a Roman altar, so it's been reused, and it's actually been inverted, so the top is at the bottom now and the base is here, and the base has been hollowed out and a hole put through for the water to drain out of there.
I want to pause here just a moment to recap and consolidate what we've learned so far. The Roman legions started leaving Britain around 383 AD and were completely gone by 410 AD. The Roman Empire had come under attack from Germanic and Jewish tribes across the empire, and back in Italy there was also a lot of internal unrest. This meant the Roman legions were needed back home to defend Rome itself. Of course, not every single Roman left. Many Roman citizens remained in Britain after the army had left, as many of them had become intermarried into the local population. But it is safe to say that the moment the armies had left Britain's shores, the local communities started taking the stone from the wall to build other things. And why not? It provided a vast resource of quality faced stone, completely free. All they had to do was carry it away. This is the main reason there are vast areas where nothing of the wall remains, and then in other areas it remains almost intact. The areas where the local population is the densest is where the wall has been robbed the most. As we saw at the beginning, very little has survived around Bo'ness and where the city of Carlisle lies today, until you get further east to Walltown. Then, where the landscape is more rural and rugged, a great deal of the wall survives, mostly because there was less reason to steal it, being fewer people needing fewer dwellings, but also as the terrain made it harder to carry the stone away. Then further east you get to Hexham, and the abbey here was built entirely from the stone on Hadrian's Wall, mostly robbed from the fort at Corbridge. As Anna Gray, my colleague, has already explained, people like John Clayton were directly responsible for saving sections of the wall. And of course today the protection is the responsibility of English Heritage. Where I am today is a village called Heddon-on-the-Wall. The name Heddon comes from the Anglo-Saxon words heath, meaning heather, and dun, meaning hill. Therefore, the hill where heather grew. This section of surviving wall is 255 metres long and 3 metres wide, which is the original width before Hadrian ordered it to be narrowed. To the north of the wall was the North Ditch, as we know, and this particular section was filled with stakes and forked branches, if you like, a sort of Roman barbed wire. As you can see, once the legions had left, much of this stone was taken and buildings in the village were constructed using that stone. This circular construction in the wall is not Roman, but thought to be medieval, created when the wall was dismantled, and is simply a kiln for drying corn. Town Farm, at the west end of this section of the wall, sits on top of Mile Castle 12, but no trace of it is visible above ground today. From this location here at Heddon-on-the-Wall, we're going to be heading east towards Newcastle city centre itself, and we're about 2 or 3 miles out of the city here. From this point, the wall actually disappears underneath the main road. And most locals know this as the West Road, but it's also known as the Military Road. And that is because it was built in 1746 by General Wade to move troops quickly between Newcastle and Dumfries after the Second Jacobite Rebellion. Wade used Hadrian's Wall as a foundation for his road. Evidence of this we will see shortly, uncovered by Northumbrian Water when they were doing some work in the city. And of course, this is not to be confused with the military road that Anna Gray talked about, which was constructed some 1,600 years before and is completely different to this one. The next location the wall becomes obvious is here in West Denton, right on the side of the A69, which is the main road between Newcastle and Carlisle. Not much left, just a couple of courses of stone with the infill material. However, just 100 metres or so across the busy junction with the A1, we have a 65-metre stretch of wall incorporating Denton Hall turret, which was turret 7B. Of course, its construction was a similar layout to the others we've already seen, although this one is built with unusually large stones. It's thought this turret had 3 stories, accessed inside by a wooden ladder, which ascended from this platform here, and a flat roof on top acting as a lookout platform. At the end of this section of wall at Denton Turret, we're looking west at the moment. You can see this bungalow is sitting right on top of the wall, and the chap who lives here has actually carved the head of Hadrian to commemorate the fact that his bungalow is sitting right on top of Hadrian's Wall. Fantastic. The wall continues pretty much along the route followed by the A186 into the city centre, also known as the West Road. Another few hundred metres reveals another outcrop of wall at Denton Burn, situated at the roadside again near a busy junction, hardly noticed by the local people. And this tiny section that remains is literally on the edge of a garage forecourt. A little further along the A186 we come to another major junction on the approach to the city centre, the junction with Tubal Lonnan. In August of 2021, Northumbrian Water were digging to install a new water main and discovered the early foundations of the wall running right down the middle of the road here. A little further along the A186 east into the city and we reach Benwell. This was the location of a Roman fort, one of 13 built along the wall. This one was occupied by a cavalry regiment from northern Spain, and it was known as Condacum. As already explained, after the wall was built, a huge earthwork vallum was constructed to create a separated military zone. Here at Benwell we see a causeway built across the vallum so that roads leading from the south could cross into the fort. This one lines up directly where the south gateway of the fort would have been. Halfway across the causeway would have been an arched gateway with large wooden doors. Today, a housing estate built in the 1930s covers the area. A few hundred metres away lies the remains of a Roman Mithraic temple, similar to the one we saw at Block Alicia. Today it survives slap bang in the middle of another housing estate. It was discovered in 1862 during an excavation by the then landowner George Whitewick Rendell, when this area was a park. The temple was built in 178 AD, just outside the walls of the fort, as you can see from this diagram. It was dedicated to a Roman god, Antenor. It appears that this was the only temple anywhere in Roman Britain to recognise this god. Most Roman temples were dedicated to gods that would protect or give strength in battle, etc. But there is no clear understanding of who this particular god was. Some think it may have been a Celtic god who symbolised some rare quality that the Romans decided to adopt when they arrived here. Whoever the god was, it was important enough for the Romans to build and dedicate a temple to. A statue once stood in the temple, and the head of that statue still remains. It can be seen in the Great North Museum in Newcastle. Foundations of the wall have been found in the city centre recently during excavation work. On the original plans for the route of the wall, drawn up by Hadrian himself, the intention was to start the wall in Newcastle, where a bridge crossed the River Tyne called Pons Aelius, which was guarded by a fort of the same name. The remains of that fort lie beneath the medieval castle constructed around 1172. However, the plans were changed very early into the construction to extend the wall to the fort at Segedunum, 4 miles to the east. Leaving this area without the wall would have left a vulnerable gap in the frontier. It is thought this oversight may have been realised during Hadrian's visit in 122 AD, though no conclusive evidence exists to verify this. This area around the medieval castle keep is quite an exciting location, right in the heart of the city, because here, within metres of each other, you have 3 distinct eras of construction. Going back in time, we have the most recent structure, which is the Victorian railway arches, built in the mid-1800s. These arches intrude right into the centre of the site that was once the medieval castle, built in 1172 by Robert Curthose, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, and giving the city its name, New Castle. The Black Gate, as it is known, was added 100 years later by Henry III. These medieval structures are both built on top of the oldest and original building here, the fort of Pons Aelius, which in Roman means Bridge of Hadrian. The next significant showing of the wall doesn't appear until Wall's End, aptly named as the eastern end of the wall as we know it today, and where the numbering of the mile castles and turrets begin. Just before we reach Segedunum, we reach the area where Mile Castle 1 is situated, buried under Union Street here in Wall's End. And finally we reach the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall here at Segedunum. There is an 80-metre section of wall visible, with a reconstruction of what the wall would have looked like next to it. This short outcrop of wall runs at 90 degrees and right angle to the wall, and basically sealed off the area between the south wall of the fort and the river. So that concludes the journey from west to east. I do hope you've enjoyed it and it's proved to be informative and enjoyable at the same time. My grateful thanks go to Anna Gray of Discover Lakeland Tours for her input, support and countless hours of research in the making of this film. 2022 is going to be a very, very big and eventful year here on Hadrian's Wall. So if you've never visited this part of the country before, it is well worth a visit, and there would be no better time to come than this year. If you have been here before, then again there's going to be lots and lots of events that are obviously new and exciting to witness. Whenever you plan your visit, I hope it will be enjoyable and memorable. I'm sure it will. As always, please subscribe to this channel, give it a like and switch on the notifications so you can stay up to date with all my latest releases. I look forward to being with you again very soon, but for now it's goodbye.